The man who's going to do that for us is a senior producer and presenter at CNBC Africa. Please help me welcome Georgie Ndirangu. And you need a microphone? Let me give you a microphone. There you go.
Perfect. I don't know where the clicker
You need the clicker. The clicker's right
here.
Yeah.
Right. So it's definitely an honor speaking today in Germany, miles away from home. Now, given the topic and the country that it looks like I'm from, one would automatically think, what would someone from Kenya or Rwanda know about reporting equally? That's the general sentiment, and we've heard it when we shared some of the conversations across the last couple of days. But let's give it till the end of the presentation. Hopefully we'll also have a sense of what kind of perspectives we'll see from different parts of the world. So, just to create a bit of context before we open up with the game, the task that we've been given as media is heavy, very heavy. And the audience entirely depends on our feedback, our insight, what we produce, to consume and go about their perspective in life. So we have both a pro and a con as media. Pro, the more content you churn out, and the more consumers get to interact with your products, or possibly the news that you churn out, they trust you a lot more and they consume a lot easier. A con is that the more you give them the information and the more they consume, the trust levels go higher and the fact-checking as a consumer or the general public becomes a lot less. So let's kick things off with some bit of perspective. Now, we are all journalists, at least most of us for the most part, and presumably well-traveled. We know a lot about different parts of the world. So let's just test that, put that into theory or practicality. I would like us to focus our attention on the screen, and you could tell me, what country do you think this is? Possibly we'll start off with you. What country do you think this is? Or at least from which part of the world?
Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia. I will not ask you. What country do you think this is?
Maybe your home country?
All right, could be. But this is actually Rwanda. Kigali, Rwanda. So when we think about Rwanda, the bulk of the people would think 1994 genocide, what happened after that. But what we do not know is that Rwanda has over 60% representation of women in parliament, about a similar number in the judiciary, in the cabinet, among the highest representation of women in the world. Something that makes headlines, but headlines if you're looking for that bit of information. So again, perspective. We have another picture. Where do you think this is? Anyone? You, sir? Where do you think this is?
I would say an Asian city, Hong Kong.
Close?
I would say Dubai.
Dubai, I thought so. This is actually Indonesia. So what we know about Jakarta, Indonesia, most of the time we know about child labor, we know about trafficking and the issues on fishing, what had happened there. But Indonesia has a commission that is being set up by the finance minister, Melinda Gates Foundation, Strive Masiyiwa, where they try to address some of the challenges that have been caused by tech, and they try and make that into solutions that can now push agendas of developing economies. And they're trying to replicate that, hopefully, to other states. We have another picture. Who can tell us where this is? Anyone? Where? Where do you think this is?
Bam.
Anywhere?
There's consensus on this side.
New York? Detroit? It's actually Detroit. Wow. Right, so we had a talk from Lucas Chancel, co-director, World Inequality Lab, with some really harsh realities on the details of growing inequalities. And he mentioned the US particularly. So that's that. And then we have one more. Who can tell us where this is? At least which continent? Yeah? There we go. There we go. That's definitely Ghana. Beautiful architecture. That's Ghana. We have just 2 more pictures. This one. Medellin, actually, Colombia. And possibly for all those who've been watching Netflix, this is probably the most Spanish we got to learn last year. And the last one, who knows where this is? Wakanda, baby. Actually, we were hoping you would get that wrong for the purpose of the presentation. We can't fail that exam. We definitely have representation. So the aim of this kind of pictures is to basically tell us or tell you that for you to report with so much authority about a certain place, at least know a bit more about the place. So we have a lot of people talking about the developing regions, the developed regions, but from either a transferred information point of view or information that is not as contextualized, at least from the local point of view. Let me give you one example from where I come from. So born in Kenya, but I live in Rwanda. So in Kenya, 30th January 2018, the opposition party actually had a swearing-in ceremony for the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, to have him as president of the people. Now, you're probably wondering why this is news. The reason why this is news is because there was already a president, legally elected, democratic, president by the Constitution, President Uhuru Kenyatta. By the end of that month, the most Googled item in Kenya, at least from indicators from all over the world, was who is the president of Kenya now? We had 2 presidents. Raila Odinga, president of the people, and Uhuru Kenyatta, president of the republic. So when international media came to Kenya, conveniently, if you know what I mean from the African context, the people that they got to speak to were the protesters. So you can imagine the kind of information that was transferred now to a global setting. They only got, for the most part, that bit of information, the protesters' point of view. But the local media and media within East Africa knew a lot more about what happened within that electoral process, right? So that's within the local context of East Africa. And we're trying to equate this to how we report unequally on matters that affect us all over the world, or at least within different pockets of the world. Let's move on now to something that we relate to, or a picture that we've interacted with over the last couple of days, right? And I'll come back to you. And you probably, having interacted with millennials, this is a picture that you saw. So what comes to mind when you see this?
I see someone who, well, I actually tend to, have you seen the picture of him with the dinner plate on top? Like being a toddler?
Yeah, right, exactly.
It reminds me a little bit of that.
Right. So this was one way to look at it. And then we had this picture. So the first picture was reported by Reuters. And this was what made news all over, because it showed what the world already thought of President Donald Trump, that he was not on the same page with other leaders. But then there were also other camera angles, but not all media houses picked it. We had this angle that was posted by Emmanuel Macron, President of France. And it showed him addressing the G7 leaders. Of course, his PR team, fantastic, picked that, because it showed that he was the one leading that conversation at that particular time. Then there was this picture that showed Chancellor Angela Merkel, of course, Italian Prime Minister as well, leading the conversation. And it was on his Twitter feed. He said that he was working to represent and defend Italian interests. Nothing that was shown in the first picture. And then we also had this one, of course, that shows the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, a lot more relaxed. Donald Trump, a lot more relaxed. Chancellor Angela Merkel, a lot more relaxed, and everyone else feeling like, we're on the same page. But again, because it did not speak to the narrative that we already had, it was not reported as such, right? So that was that. So we have these 4 pictures, each of them with a different reaction, at least from the general public, or evoking a different response. So that's the kind of responsibility that we within the media have been given. Which brings us now to our points. Within the session, we'll have different points that we'll tackle on in terms of reporting equally, or inequalities of reporting. Number 1 was local context. I gave you what happened in Kenya. So we have to ensure that we have local representation, or at least contextual reporting. Number 2, in an ideal world, all the information is given to the general public, and then they make up their mind how to assess all the information that has been given. Point to note, in an ideal world. Sometimes it does not fit the editor's agenda, sometimes it does not fit the producer's agenda, or the media house's agenda. We all know about that. We have our different editorial policies, but it's up to us in an ideal world to just provide all the information for the general public to assess for themselves. Now, if this is how diverse our thoughts are, you can only imagine how much of an implication it has on the general public, which brings us now to a bit of video. Being a journalist, of course, as curious as most people are, we wanted to know whether people really understand the topic. And the topic in itself was how newsrooms can tackle inequality, how augmented newsrooms can tackle reporting inequalities. Let's just get back to... Yeah, that was definitely Rwanda. How augmented newsrooms can tackle reporting inequalities. So the topic in itself was a bit confusing for some of the people that we spoke to. Was it inequalities in the newsroom? Was it reporting on inequalities? Or was it reporting unequally? Right? So all 3, depending on how you look at it, there's a lot of misrepresentation or a lot of misinterpretation. So we went around over the last couple of days and we asked journalists as well from all over the world to just send us what they think of this particular topic and the kind of inequalities or things that they resonate with in the different countries. And I think we have the video. We could just play that now to just hear a talk. First off, we had Abu from the DW. If you don't know him, I'm sure some of you know him. If you don't know him, you've definitely seen the hair. So he gave us a bit of context.
As a journalist, I think it is extremely hard to cover stories in an unequal way because you're covering stories from different regions and sometimes you have an agenda or goal, not just reporting the story, but maybe you want to impart ideas or information. So it's pretty hard to report about inequality, say, in Kenya, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Guinea.
We were always taught that the strange news, or rather let me say the bad news, is the news. People rarely find interest in reporting good things, and even we as a people, I think in general, we usually tune into news stations or we put on our TV to hear the gossip, to hear what went wrong in a situation. And I feel like the media doesn't understand how much influence it has in forming opinions when it constantly reports negative issues.
Right, so for the first 2, we've had about local context and about what sells. For the second part, about what sells, a more recent issue, actually today morning, was North Korea and Trump. Kim Jong-un and Trump. Now, we've had the reports in the States. The news said that we still have the sanctions on North Korea, but the denuclearization program was still ongoing, and until that was done, the sanctions would not be lifted. But in North Korea, the front of the papers, as of today morning, read that in the near future, sanctions will be lifted by the UN and, of course, other partner states, and the economy should be able to progress within the trajectory that had been set before. So, perspective. North Korea gave a different perspective, of course, not as factual as it would have been, but they didn't necessarily lie. They just didn't tell the truth. Right? They didn't exactly lie, they just didn't tell the truth. It wasn't as factual or as categorically stated as it was by Donald Trump when he mentioned to his international media, or at least media within the States. Right, let's move on to focus on Global Village and another issue on ownership and privatization.
There's a theory that new media is like the global village because everyone is connected to everybody in a way, and you know, you could be you could be in a slum in Mumbai just by clicking a few links on the internet, and I think that will I'm not sure if it will root out inequality, but it will highlight that it's there.
I want to talk about ownership in the Egyptian journalism scene. Actually, it's very important right now because, first of all, we don't know who owns what. And second of all, even if the journalist wants to say something, I think he has to go through many gates before he has to say this exact word or do this investigative report or report on certain issues. So I think, first of all, the audience must know the information coming from them, from the media, who is telling them this information, the owner, their ideologies, and whether they're censored, and whether they're talking about their interest or not, of the audience interest or the public interest.
The other issue.
Right, before we move on now, apologize, that gentleman is slightly naked. So we have a crucial point that has been raised. Now we have the MD of AJ Plus, Qatar, who will come to talk about digital information. We'll not get into that. But there's one on ownership and privatization, and a lot of us are in private media houses. There's the issue on selling your soul or your editorial policy to the highest bidder. And I know without a doubt, if we ask some of these conversations off air or off the record, we have a lot of feedback on people who've actually sponsorship comes in and your editorial policies are a bit, flexible, a lot more flexible than they would have been before. Case in point, we had the London Evening Standard. There was a particular time when Uber had a lot of issues in London, and they were also the main sponsor, or at least among the advertisers. So what they did was that the first 4 pages, they had adverts on Uber, huge adverts, huge spreads, 4 pages. And then on the 5th page, they would have the story about Uber. So generally, as a consumer, and we've heard about the reading trends, you most of the time don't even make it to the 5th page, if that. And sometimes, even when you read it, it doesn't have as much weight because you've just seen 4 pages saying how Uber is actually the best or preferred means of transport. So there was that. So we need to understand that bit on compromising between your editorial policy or selling your soul to the highest bidder, and whether you're actually telling people factual or contextual information are not guided by monetary benefits or such. As we move on to a bit on the ending, so we have all those issues that we've mentioned on the macro level. We've touched on all those media houses withholding information, local context, and of course, we're trying to understand what sells and what doesn't. But also we have the micro level, the inequalities within the newsrooms that have an impact on how we report equally. And that brings us now to the last bit of the videos.
Issue comes in the aspect of leadership of media houses and even, newsrooms. You'll find like there are few women who own media houses. You'll find few women who are managers of big media houses, and it affects probably a few of the reportings and everything. But if we could have a balance, like you find women being news managers and human resources, probably you even have a head of a big media company and it's a woman.
Inequalities in reporting that I would say I face day to day is probably credibility, because editors or producers will feel like if they send a female journalist or female reporter on the field, they're not gonna get a strong story, and they feel like we're not aggressive enough, which is actually wrong because we are actually aggressive. So they will feel like we would go on the field and not get a really strong story and a really good one. That's why most of the time they choose to send male journalists or reporters on the field to get stories.
As women, you need someone who can empower you to give you the hardest stories, because that's what you always look out for. But you know, they say, this panel you cannot do because it has this and this and this, and this you can do because it's a little bit softer. So, you know, they decide for you before you even get to understand what you can do or what you cannot do. As a female business journalist, for me, it's been a bit even more challenging when I get out to the field or in rural areas. Sometimes I even meet CEOs or people I speak to, and they will ask me, why are you tough? You are a lady. You know, so they try to relate to my gender, you know, even in regards to what I speak with them. You know, I'm not supposed to ask them tough questions, or I'm not supposed to know too much about a subject.
Perfect. So we've had one of the crucial issues on reporting, gender. We won't get much into that, but that definitely creates a bit of context. To wrap up, we said that in an ideal world, all of this works simultaneously and we have all this moving at the same pace. But we're not in utopia. If you've subscribed to The Economist, you will definitely go to that and make sure that you have value for your money, and their perspective on things, subconsciously or not, becomes your perspective of how you view things, at least from the first point of interaction with that bit of news. Now, on the other hand, as we talk about inequalities in reporting, we have to understand that how augmented newsrooms can now fix the issue on reporting, and equally, we might have to assess whether the resources that we've put in now need to be reallocated. So in this point, we have, for example, Vice Media. Early 2018, they've amassed a young audience, but they mentioned that they missed their revenue targets by $100 million because they relied on their cable channel. So we might see a lot of these augmented newsrooms now move on to digital channels because they anticipate that most of the revenue will come from there. We also have issues like Wall Street Journal, the New York Times themselves. The New York Times said that they pushed their revenue over $1 billion for the first time this year, mainly because they stopped focusing on revenue that they would have gotten from advertisers, but they focused it on online subscriptions. And Google and Facebook got the bulk of the revenue from advertisers. Because, I mean, in this day and age, there's no way you would compete with Google and Facebook, at least for now. And then we also have the issue on, now, for media houses, even if we don't have the prospects of working together, final point, before we used to see editors, analysts, and all these people working in different offices. But now we have the editors, the coders, everyone working together, where we see journalists have the data analysis. They say, I posted a tweet and the person who read it was a woman living in possibly Southeast Asia who was 23 years of age. So we have all those working at the same time. Now we have a lot, because for the interest of time, we're not able to get through a lot of that, but we might need to be a bit more deliberate about how the changing newsroom or the new newsroom reports equally. There was just a bit of it in the little time that we had. Thank you very much for your time.